I'm Amira, and this is the Politics of Bits. Lots of attention has been paid to what's going on in crypto policy at the federal level, but much less has been paid to what's going on in the states. But there's a lot happening there. And so here to talk about that is one of the few people in crypto policy who's been involved in policy at both the state and the federal level, Matt Homer. Matt was the first ever executive deputy superintendent of the New York Department of Financial Services, where he oversaw licensing for cryptocurrency companies. Today, he's the founder of the Venture Department, a venture fund that invests in early stage founders building the new financial systems of the future. Matt, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Samir. I'm excited to be here.
Let's get into it. I think we've talked a lot about what happens in crypto at the federal level. And I think a lot of people don't quite get the distinction of what's happening at the federal level versus the state level. So, it'd be great to just give us an overview of what's happened in crypto policy at the federal level to date versus what do we see happening at the state level to date. And then we could talk about how we expect that to change in the next few years. But what got us here?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, you have to go back a little ways, but we won't go all the way back. But the basic background that's important to understand is that we have what's become referred to as a dual banking system in the United States. Federal banking law state banking law actually predates federal banking law, right? And so states were always sort of the original regulators of financial services, and then the federal system has sort of grown as well over time. But the dual banking system, in a nutshell, refers to this concept that you have federal regulators and you have state regulators of financial services, and states have historically been the primary regulator. We can get sort of more into the details of banking. For example, you have now today the option to get a banking charter from a federal regulator, the OCC, or you have the option to get a banking charter from a state regulator. If you get it from a state regulator, you would still have a federal regulator, either the Federal Reserve or the FDIC. But much of crypto, zooming forward to kind of like, where we are today with crypto is regulated primarily at the state level today, right? At least when we're talking about the companies that are involved in the movement of assets or the custody of assets. And that is often through a money transmitter license, or in the case of New York, a money transmitter license and a bit license. But so that's kind of the general state of play.
Yeah. So what I think a lot of people don't get is that you have to, if you are a company operating across the United States that does something like money transmission. So for example, Coinbase, not only do you need to have federal regulation and abide by that, but you actually have to go out and apply to, I think it's like 48 different money transmitter licenses across the country. And so there's a lot of state and federal regulation you have to abide by just to get to this point, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's been, the initial way that, if we go back to kind of the early days of crypto, the first way in which many companies were licensed, right, was through a money transmitter license. And you're exactly right. Those are issued by individual states. And then there's also, through FinCEN and MSB registration that is often done at the same time.
So let's think about what that looks like today for crypto, because I think what's happened is there's sort of a default set of rules that applies to a lot of companies that do some sort of money transmission. So, like classic centralized exchanges might fall under that. Maybe stablecoin companies would fall under that. And then there's kind of a vacuum at the federal level. And there's, sort of the default regulation that's been in place that has existed for, money businesses, money-related businesses for years and years that are sort of linked to banking regulation. And then there's this new wave of crypto-specific legislation that's happening at the state level. So where are we today when it comes to, the biggest sort of crypto rules at the state level?
Yeah. Well, the evolution of it is sort of interesting, right? So, I've been a federal regulator and a state regulator, and it is very different, right? Seeing it from those two different perspectives, for a lot of different reasons. But when I was a state regulator for the state of New York, it was during part of my tenure overlapped with the prior Trump administration. And it was a very interesting time because the federal government was actually starting to issue charters to trust companies. So if you remember, there were like a few companies that were trying to get this. Only one ended up getting it, Anchorage, right? So Anchorage has a trust company charter from the OCC. It's the only firm in the crypto space to have a prudential bank charter from the federal government.
And what does that mean? Like, what does that allow Anchorage to do? And why is it so interesting that there's only one?
Yeah, well, it sort of just got through the process, in time. I mean, there were others that were trying. I mean, most notably Paxos. There was another firm called Pertigo, and Paxos Anchorage was just the first. Was I think a big part of it they were just able to get through in time before the administration ended, and then the other ones that were seeking the license, yeah, they were not able to get in time, and then the current administration just let those applications expire. But I mean, there are a number of benefits. I mean, one of the main benefits is that you have preemption over state law. So if you have an OCC charter, you can operate in every state without consideration of the banking laws issued by those specific state legislatures. And a trust charter, you can get a trust charter from a state or very briefly from the federal government. Very broad powers, actually. So it's basically a bank light charter. So you have all the powers of a bank, but typically you cannot take deposits and you cannot hypothecate funds. But otherwise, you have kind of the fiduciary powers associated with a bank. For the last 4 years, that has not been an option. States have been the only game in town. If you wanted to get a license anywhere, like the state is sort of is the only option today.
Right. So it's been like Anchorage, and then everyone else wants to get in the game has
Yeah,
to go operate at the state level. And
that's
then
right.
New York, New York started getting the game, and this was you were at DFS around this time. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, I was there during again, part of the last Trump administration. It was a very interesting time actually because, and it's one of the reasons I'm actually very optimistic about the upcoming 4 years because there is a competition that existed between states and the federal government, right? So in the OCC under Brian Brooks started opening things up, made it possible for banks to custody assets. A lot of, all of this was kind of rolled back, unfortunately, during the current administration. But at the time, it was, I mean, they were really being quite innovative, right, in terms of allowing the banking industry to evolve around digital assets and to have digital assets as a core part of their infrastructure. And what that meant at the state level is that we said, oh wow, like, well, we want to be competitive too, right? We want these companies to come to us. If you're a regulator, typically, you want to be able to regulate. You would prefer to like have someone come and be subject to your regulation as opposed to like a competitor's regulation, right? And so that was the dynamic that existed, which I think is actually quite healthy because what it meant is that we were competing to have the best regulatory frameworks. And no regulator in the US wants to have like a weak framework. Like everyone is a bit, everyone wants to have a mature, serious framework that can last the test of time because regulators don't want to deal with problems later on, right? So I think that dynamic that existed, I think will exist again in the next 4 years. And it's something, people haven't started talking about quite yet. And a key part of that will be the OCC. We don't yet know who will be nominated to be the comptroller, but I suspect whoever it is, they will likely reopen that licensing pathway, not just for crypto firms. I mean, it could be for fintech firms, other types of firms, right? But I anticipate they will open up chartering again and entertain new applications.
That's a really interesting idea to set up, right? Which is probably the reason, or a big part of the reason, that we have DFS and such a robust licensing regime in New York is an outgrowth of some of that action around the end of the Trump administration 1.0. Can you talk a little bit about what that experience was like at DFS? Like, at what point are you waking up and looking at what's going on, at the federal level and saying, "Hey, we should do something about that."
Yeah.
And maybe baked into that, like talk a little bit about the role of the New York Department of Financial Services.
Yeah, yeah, and I'll tell you about both of them. So New York was the first regulator, maybe in the world, actually, to regulate crypto. It was very controversial at the time, right? I mean, it still is a little bit, but it was they created the superintendent, basically 10 years ago of the Department of Financial Services, Ben Losky, saw sort of a gap in the market, and DFS had been newly created and had been given a unique type of authority called gap authority, which meant that if there was a consumer finance product that was not being regulated by anyone else, DFS could self promulgate rules to regulate that. And so this is one of the first areas where they use that new authority. They did public hearing. I mean, to their credit, they went through, an incredible kind of public hearing process, received a ton of comments, and then the bit license emerged out of that.
And this is like
And
2014, 2015,
yeah,
basically.
20, yeah, 15, 16 period. I mean, it was done over a course of a couple of years with the kind of the rulemaking process. Um, and yeah, so like I came in much later. I came in 2019, like with the mandate to basically scale that operation, right? And to kind of make it a more significant part of the institution of the agency. Historically, the agency was comprised of two functions: banking and insurance, and then crypto was added as sort of like a third important part of the agency. And that's the part of the agency that I was overseeing. And while I was there, we gave Fidelity a trust charter, authorized PayPal to enter the space. But I remember the moment when the federal government got really active because Brian Brooks, who is the comptroller, he was prior to that he was at Coinbase, and I was his regulator when he was at Coinbase. He was the general counsel of Coinbase, and I got to know him in that capacity. And then he went to the OCC, and then he was initially not the acting comptroller, right? He was in a deputy type of role, and then he became the acting comptroller and announced all this stuff he was going to do. And yeah, I remember like the competitive juices really got flowing
So you're
at
like
the
opening up your
agency.
inbox and you're like, "Holy smokes,
Yeah,
the OCC is doing all this stuff."
yeah, and it's like, well, what does this mean for us? And like, and what do we think of the guidance, right? And what should we do? And I have to say, it was actually like a lot of fun, right? Because then you have sort of someone you're now in a race with someone, right? And you get to kind of compete a little bit.
So, can you talk a little bit more about those motivations? Like when you're looking up at the state level and seeing what's happening at the federal level, is that how much the motivation is political, right? The superintendent of the agency has
Yeah.
political ambitions, they want to carve themselves out. How much of it is economic, like you want business in New York? How much of it is just like, hey, I have a yardstick and I just want to put up against that? Like where do the motivations um of regulators come from?
Yeah. I think there's a bit of a difference actually between state and federal regulators. Federal regulators, here's the difference, right? Having kind of worked in both. Federal regulators tend to have a very narrow mandate. So it's like only what Congress is. I mean, this administration has kind of stretched it, right? But like they're only authorized to kind of oversee areas that Congress has given them explicit authority to oversee. But they're very well resourced, right? So you have, because they're independent, they have often like independent sources of income, right? So in the case of the FDIC, they're charging assessments to banks. So very well resourced, but very kind of narrow mandate. The state level, it's the opposite. So very poorly resourced, typically, right? So like, but very extremely broad mandate because you basically have the authority to supervise everything in financial services other than areas where the US Congress has given the federal government preemption. So like if you look at a state regulator, they have dozens and dozens and dozens of license categories, right? So they'll have like really for even some esoteric areas that, like a bail bondsman in New York. To be a bail bondsman, you need like a license, right? To be a check casher, you need a license, right? So it's not just kind of the licenses that are people are familiar with. There's tons of licenses. So and then the mandate is a little different too. So at the state level, there is an economic development mandate, which is common as a regulator. Um, and in addition to kind of the kind of just safety and soundness and consumer protection mandates that exist, for regulators generally. Um, it can be. I think regulators have become a little bit more political. When I was at the FDIC 10 years ago, it felt far less political, just the system, than it does today, and it's become politicized through a number of kind of things we could talk about, like, but the ousting of the CFPB director, and then the firing of the FDIC chair. And so it's become at the federal level, far more political than it used to be. At the state level, New York kind of occupies a unique spot, I guess I'd say, right? In the insurance sector, actually, they have an expression which is 49 plus one. 49 plus one means, like 49 states and then New York. And you typically have like you have one approach for 49 states, and then, a different one for New York. And, but it's kind of true more broadly. And New York, it's been a financial services capital. It's the oldest banking law actually in the country. I mean, it predates any federal banking law. And New York, there's sort of a New York state of mind, which is that, the New York DFS tends to think of itself as more of an equivalent to a federal regulator as opposed to a state regulator. Um, and so there's constantly a desire to sort of like prove that you operate at that level. I mean, it's just sort of the way like the incentives are set up. And look, yeah, I mean, there's sort of, I wouldn't say it's political with like like in the partisan way, but there certainly is ambition, right? And like, I think that often, like a superintendent, at the department is looking to parlay that into something else. And so there's sort of a desire to kind of do new things. I mean, the advantage of being a state regulator is that you can move far more quickly than a federal regulator. You actually can experiment. You actually can try new things. So that's yeah. I mean that's uh, yeah, part of the kind of calculus or set of incentives that exist.
Let me push a little bit here because I think what's interesting about this is you're as a person, I know you're really pro crypto, right? You're really open to
Yeah.
technology. You're excited about it. I think a lot of people in the space look at the set of regulations at the New York level and they look at the bit licensing regime and they say, this is not good for crypto, right? Like what
Yeah.
happened here is actually not positive in the space. And I'd love for you to outline sort of the arc of you coming in, helping create sort of the start of what the New York licensing regime looks like, and help people understand like how that came to be, um, and why it feels for people today like it might be really overbearing, or maybe you don't think it's overbearing. So it would be great to get your perspective on that evolution.
Yeah. Well, I have kind of two different sets of thoughts that may be sort of like conflicting, but maybe can also be reconciled. And one is that I think New York has actually done more to legitimize the space than anything. I mean, it's been the only, the it is sort of the gold standard in terms of like it's actually like getting a New York trust company charter is like whatever, if you're a crypto firm in the US, like that is the most um prestigious sort of authorization you can get in the United States, right? So
In the
it
absence
is.
of any kind of federal legislation,
And
yeah.
yeah, federal, yeah. And so I think that actually, in some ways, is legitimized. And it's the counterfactuals are hard, right? But like I think that it has legitimized the space in a way that people don't necessarily appreciate. Um, so that's kind of the positive kind of perspective I have. But I am very sympathetic to the view that it's difficult. I mean, when I was in that role, I spent a lot of time letting people freely air their opinions. And I think that's important as a regulator, actually, to let people kind of vent. It's not that common, actually. Most regulators are not comfortable with that. I think it's a very important thing to do. And and I heard a lot. I mean, I heard everything. And in my experience, what people dislike about the New York process, about the New York regulatory structure around this is more related to process and less around the rules. Like if you sit down and you break down, okay, here's what it means, here are the rules. Most people like actually have no issue with it. The problem is that it takes a very long time to get one. And then once you get it, any new product or service you want to embark upon has to also be approved by DFS, right? So, and then DFS is a very tough, um, supervisor. They're conducting examinations of it. So I think that I do think that it could be updated or modernized just because, it's been a decade and a lot has happened and the space has sort of evolved. But I think most of the things that could be improved are really more around the implementation of it. That's where I hear most of the concerns, which I think are valid.
And how much of that is just like lack of resources versus unwillingness or lack of incentives to improve the process?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a little bit of both. I mean, the team is much more resourced when I was there. I mean, I think they've got like 60 people working on crypto, which might be the
Wow.
most of any regulator in the world. So there are resources. I think the incentives are just really hard in a regulator. If you're a regulator, you are blamed if things go wrong. You're never rewarded. You're never kind of given credit if things go right, right? So like your incentive is almost always just to avoid downside risk. And so I think I don't think this is unique to DFS. I think it exists, and it would start if there were ever a federal pathway, like it would exist there too, right? It exists with every regulator, which is just that um, you know you, you don't want to. It's there are not a lot of incentives to be the person to put your neck on the line and approve a novel or new product that where you may not fully understand the implications of it. I think that's really the bigger issue than resourcing.
Let's talk about that in contrast to, I think, the Wyoming model. So there's like the New York model, which is, as you said, probably the most robust crypto regulatory regime in the country, maybe the world. And then there's the Wyoming model, where I think there's interest in making Wyoming the home for a lot of crypto innovation in
Hmm.
the United States. And they're doing stuff like, there's a Wyoming Stablecoin Commission where they're talking about Wyoming issuing their own kind of stable token. There's a lot of talk about sort of a Bitcoin state reserve. How do you think about how those two things contrast? Obviously, New York and Wyoming probably couldn't be two more different states, right? They have very different
Yeah, yeah,
mandates.
yeah.
But, they seem to me to be on the other side of the spectrum of using state resources towards pushing towards innovation rather than sort of creating a regulatory regime. And I'm curious how you think about that balance.
Yeah, well, I'm very excited about Wyoming. I think New York is a crypto. I do think New York is undoubtedly like the center of crypto, if there is one. Um, but it's sort of become that despite ourselves, what I mean? Like as a government or whatever in the state, like it's not that because of anything really that I mean, as much as I like to kind of take credit for some of that, like I mean, I think it's just sort of organic factors, right? New York has capital, New York has financial services, New York has talent, New York has, whatever, just like attributes that attract kind of um, you know, builders and people who want to be part of that ecosystem. I think Wyoming has something different, which is like a really supportive legislature, a supportive regulator, right? And more of a blue sky opportunity, right? So I'm very excited about what they're doing, and they've New York was first, but Wyoming is going bigger in some ways, right? Because for they have they're a right. Of course, they've focused in part on the regulatory side, but that's not just it, right? I mean, they're also looking at how do they um, create an economic development opportunity for the state, whether that's through like their stablecoin initiative, which I think is really exciting and promising, or whether it's through sort of the things they've been thinking about in the DAO space. Um, or even the mining space. So they're very forward leaning in a way that extends beyond regulation to it's more of a whole of government approach, right? Which I think is quite exciting. And I think
Meaning, like, they're trying to throw government resources into making make this an economic development opportunity as
Yeah.
opposed to regulating activity that's already happening in state.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And then, other states have already sort of picked up pieces of what Wyoming has, you know, inspired. So like Nebraska, for example, I know that they have a licensing framework that in some ways resembles what Wyoming has done. So I think like Wyoming is like if you're a state today and you're kind of want to do something in this space, you're probably going to look at Wyoming first, actually, right? You're going to say like, what has Wyoming done? And you're going to look at that for inspiration for what you could do in your state. But the reality, right, is that you can only go so far with you can have like a super innovative, right? I mean, government and like that only takes you so far, right? And there are a lot of these other sort of organic factors I was talking about that are outside of the ability of a government to directly influence, right? Just having like density of talent and like existing innovation networks and all that. That's very hard, and that's why um, you know uh, I think this is beyond crypto. This is just like innovation hubs generally. They tend to sort of self perpetuate. Success begets more success, right? I mean, it's like the story of Silicon Valley. Catalyzing that at the very beginning, kickstarting that at the very beginning, like out of nothing, um, is very challenging. And there are places all over the world that are trying to do this, right? I mean, the UAE, other places, and it's um, that anyway. I think it's very exciting, but like it's a real it's a challenge.
What I think is interesting is there's a bunch of states and they're all taking what I would call signaling style approaches towards becoming more crypto friendly. So, like this week, Texas introduced legislation to create a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Pennsylvania is introducing legislation to invest up to 10% of public funds in crypto. In Michigan, there's an effort to create like a Michicoin, which is a Michigan-based
Mm.
cryptocurrency. Um, I'm curious if you're advising some of these states that are saying, "Hey, we want to be part of this evolution of this new technology and movement." What would you advise them to do? Where do you think there's actual impact to be had? Because I'll be honest, I feel like a lot of these are more signaling than noise.
Yeah. Yeah, no, a lot of them are. But I think that you have to start somewhere, right? I mean, one of the things we did actually, it's
Signaling
a
is
proof.
important. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, no, it's very
Yeah.
important. I think there's a few things I would do. I mean, one is you want to find a way to crowd in innovators, right? Like you can only if you're you can only carry so much on your own back, right? At the end of the day, like if you're trying to create like an innovative private sector innovation ecosystem, like you need to create incentives for people to come in and be part of that, right? So one thing like we did in New York, which is not something we invented, it was started in the UK, is we did a tech sprint as a regulator. We brought in, it was basically like a creation collaboration between us and a lot and kind of private sector companies to develop new tools for supervising crypto firms that were better for us and better for the firms. There are lots of different ways you can do that, and I know Wyoming has done some of that. But like you want to create programmatic efforts to bring in founders and solve problems together, and then you want to find ways that you can then scale those, right? And so like whether it's a blockchain based um, identity system or blockchain based property rights tool for like water rights in the Mountain West, where I'm originally from. Like, there are lots of private public collaborations. I think those are important, and I think that's a way to also sort of catalyze things. The other thing is to kind of find, as a state, find your winners already, right? I mean, there's probably people that have grown up in your state who are successful entrepreneurs, and even if they're no longer like living in your state, I mean, I think like kind of uh championing those people and kind of you know seeking their guidance can have a big impact. And then there's a lot of things that can be done with money, frankly, right? I think like strategic use of like pension funds and things like that actually can be significant. I mean, I'm in the venture capital space now, right? And I think, I mean, there are some of these funds, right, that will they'll go and invest small checks in venture capital funds, and then as part of it, they'll say, well, you have, as part of this, we're going to expect you to come to our jurisdiction once or twice a year and meet with founders here and consider making investments here. So there's all sorts of like tools that can be that can be used.
Yeah, what's tough about those, as you spell them out, is that you think about who is politically motivated to make these movements and their legislatures, right? And maybe some folks who are elected at the executive level, but the people who actually can implement things like programming, tech sprints, public-private partnerships, like that's not legislators, right? Those are people who
Yeah,
actually sit. They're probably civil servants or people who like sit in the executive branches. And so aligning those incentives is actually pretty difficult. It takes, I think, a particularly pioneering elected official to figure out how to square those circles.
100%. Yeah, you've got to find. I mean, the ecosystems. I mean, like Wyoming. I mean, we keep talking about Wyoming, but they've got like a few people there who are very passionate about it, right? And they're sort of the driving force. And you absolutely need that, right? I mean, you need kind of motivated, compelling individuals who are doing this, because it's like something that it's a labor of love, right? And it's something that they're really, really passionate about.
So let's fast forward because I think we've already seen a ton of interest in state regulation happening, and states getting involved in the space. If we look forward 5 years from now, what do you think the role of regulators like DFS is in crypto?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think that, well, I think states actually, I think, look, we just had a presidential election, right? And I think that went in a direction that's very positive for the industry. I think there are a few implications for states. One is that I think states actually will remain the primary licensing option for early stage companies, even if federal licensing or chartering pathways emerge. Typically, you have to be a pretty large and sophisticated institution to be able to get those, right? So, like, if you're talking
Why is
about
that? It's just like a more Byzantine process at the federal level, or just more paperwork?
just the expectations, if you look at it from the banking sector, right? If you're going to get a bank charter, it's much it's more expensive, right, in terms of like staffing or cost or other reasons, to maintain a federal charter in many instances versus a state charter. It's just not that it has to be that way, right? But that's just sort of like how it's sort of like evolved. That getting a federal charter is more challenging. Um, so I mean, what I imagine is a system. Say you do have a federal pathway, which I hope we will have, because I think like what matters for founders is optionality, right? That you have different options, and you want the reason optionality matters is because you don't know who's going to be empowered at any given point in time, right? That's like the beauty of our system. It's incredibly messy. I often hear founders say, I wish we just had one license we could get. And yeah, that's great if you can get it. But say you're like in a period where you have an administration that's totally antagonistic and they're not giving any licenses, wouldn't you rather also still have the option of getting, 49 state licenses, right? So I think that we will have I'm hopeful we'll have more federal chartering options. My guess is that for like really early stage companies, they'll still start with state licenses and then sort of graduate right to kind of federal charters. It'd be great though if the federal system were kind of more open from day one to kind of earlier stage startups, but historically that hasn't really been hasn't really been the case. Also, the other thing to kind of think about, the other implication for the next 4 years is that Republicans tend to be more yeah, they tend to value the dual banking system more than Democrats. So Democrats historically have favored more federal preemption, and Republicans have favored, preserving, the role of states. And you can see this most notably in the case of proposed stablecoin legislation. Like I think both sides in the stablecoin legislation proposal, both sides have basically agreed on what the requirements should be, right? You need to like have reserving of assets. They need to be certain types of assets. You need to be able to redeem them, right? There's like very little dispute around that. The debate has really become around, okay, well, who can actually give you a charter? And some on kind of the further left have taken the position that you should only be able to get a charter through a federal regulator, Whereas, on the right, the position has been you should have a choice as the founder. You could get a charter from a state regulator, as you can in banking today, or you can get one from a federal regulator. So I think that under a Republican administration and a Republican Congress, we may see them more actively, uh, you know, preserve a role for the states. Whereas, like, even if there's like clarity or and new federal pathways, it will also be the case. I anticipate that founders will have the option. That will just be one option, right? In addition to kind of a state option, as opposed to kind of a federal option as the only option, if that makes sense.
And I just want to tease this out because it's actually a distinction I never harped on before, which is there's what can be sort of instituted with legislation. So, for example, with stablecoin legislation, who is able to issue a charter? But it's also just an executive power of who's running the OCC to determine,
Yeah.
generally speaking, who gets bank charters or trust charters for crypto related activity.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like that, if the OCC wanted to start granting trust charters to crypto firms today, there's nothing to stop them, right? It's just the choice of the current leadership there that they're not going to grant any charters. So yeah, I mean, a
If
lot
you
of it is not just about the ability to do it, but it's also about the willingness.
Right, that is not a legislative issue. That
Right.
is a pure executive
Exactly. Yeah.
issue.
Yeah.
I want to, with this in mind, go back to sort of your days at DFS. If you were to redesign the bit licensing regime with what you know today for 2024, they call you back and they say, "Hey,
Yeah.
Matt, like we need you here." What would you do? How would it look different?
Yeah. Well, I'm not. I'm have no plans to go back into public service for a while. I've had three different government jobs in my career, and I've enjoying kind of being on the investor side and working with founders. But I think that I think transparency and accountability is really important for any regulator. It's one area where we don't really have it, frankly, at the federal level or the state level. I mean, as Operation Choke Point 2.0 has demonstrated, right? It's sort of like, where do you go for accountability, right? For a regulator, there's nothing, right? Yeah. I mean, that's not true. I mean, you can sue and things like that, but I mean, it's typical. It's
It's
like,
electoral, maybe. Yeah.
yeah, right, yeah. So, I think that's my kind of magic wand thing I would do, not just in New York, but kind of with every regulator, would be to create more transparency around processes and timelines and more accountability. Um, and yeah, I mean, which and and sort of a mechanism for here's another way of putting it, right? So, like, say you want to launch a new product or service. In my view, it should be the case that unless it's absolutely declined within a period of time, it should be considered approved. As opposed to the other way around, where if you apply for a new product or service, you just sort of have to wait around forever. And unless you get an affirmative yes, you can't do it, right? It should be flipped. It should be the onus should be on the government to object to what you're doing.
I don't want to jump around too much, but I want to talk about Choke Point 2.0 because I think you probably
Yeah,
have some perspective
yeah.
there. We had Kim Donovan on a couple of weeks ago, and she used to be chief of staff at FinCEN. I'm not sure if you know her. And one of the things she was saying is, we asked her, like, did you ever see debanking when you're at FinCEN? And she said there is no debanking department and or debanking
Oh,
portfolio, right?
okay.
And her framing was that Choke Point 2.0 was more of a failure of bureaucracy and interest in risk taking than it was sort of a proactive campaign. And I'm curious, as a regulator who's been at the FDIC, you've sort of seen what things look at the state level. Of course, that's very different. What do you think happened there? Like, what happened to get us to the point where we had this 2.0 um, framing or feel from the outside?
Well, I can only speculate, but I've experienced it myself. I mean, I've lost bank accounts kind of as a result of this, and um, you just there was guidance out there was put out early in this administration, joint guidance that I remember. I sat there and I just like kind of looked at this particular sentence for like a few minutes because it was just so absurd. And the sentence is something like, we believe that blockchain is fundamentally incompatible with safety and soundness, which is so absolutist, right? And not defended by any data at all. So what, I think like that's the tone. That was the tone from like in interagency guidance from all the prudential regulators that blockchain technology is incompatible with safety and soundness. Safety and soundness is sort of the get out of jail free card for regulators, right? Because you can like bucket it like almost anything in that. You can sort of eventually even reputational risk. You can kind of like somehow draw a line in your head between anything you want and safety and soundness, meaning kind of the prudential status of the company. um so yeah, I think that was the tone from the top. And then I mean I don't have any special insight other than I followed it closely and kind of read everything. But the other thing that I think was notable, just so that was notable, the other thing that was notable um was that decision making became centralized in Washington, actually, at least at the from what I understand, at the FDIC. So you have, for most regulators, I think maybe all of them, federal regulators, you have regional offices. And so on a day-to-day basis, say you're a bank in New York, right? You're going to go to your New York regional office for approvals of new products or services. Um, in the case of crypto, like all decisions were being sent to Washington, and bypassing kind of the regional offices, which is, I think that the reason given for that was to just create consistency, which sort of makes sense. But then also, yeah, I mean, it's hard not to think that this is a coordinated thing if like, that's the tone you're setting from the top, and then any decisions have to go through, through Washington. So I think, yeah, it's look whether how you know um directed or intentional it was, like it's had an impact. And in some ways I think like the impact, I mean the impact is real, the impact is observable, it's empirical fact. And yeah, I mean it happened. I can't imagine any scenario other than it happening through regulatory pressure. I think that's like abundantly clear.
We're going into that's great insight. Thank you. We're going into a new world. We don't know what it'll look like, but we know it'll look pretty different from a federal and state standpoint. You work with founders all the time. What advice would you give them going into this next year when it comes to setting up their businesses and working with regulators at the state or federal level?
Yeah, well, I think it's like a great time to be a founder in the space. I think, we're seeing, I think a lot of the innovation kind of, the US has always sort of kind of remained a hub, I think, even though, I mean, crypto is obviously broader, right? And it's global. And a lot of the most interesting use cases actually are outside of the US. But I think that we will see probably consolidation of kind of innovation here. So I mean, that's just one thing. Is I mean, I already see it in New York. Like people are kind of like, oh, maybe I should move to New York now, right? And which is exciting for me, being someone who lives here. But no, I mean, my general advice is to look anytime there's a change, right? There's opportunity, right? Anytime there's some sort of political change, legislative change, dislodgement of kind of past practices or whatever, any change can present opportunities. And so I think as a founder, you want to be sort of, watching that. And I think a federal, chartering pathway is sort of one example of that, right? I mean, that's something like if, it will be relevant for some founders to watch for. So, yeah, I mean, that's sort of the general advice, is that we still don't know a lot, right? I mean, like we're still, we know who some of the people are going to be. We know like, policy, we know that everything that can be undone that, was egregious probably will be undone. But, there's still a lot we have to wait to see. And so I think for founders, they need to be sort of like just watching and talking with people who you know are close to those processes, and kind of spotting good opportunities.
Matt Homer, thanks so much.
Thanks, Samira.